What would you do if desperation forced you to make an unthinkable choice? In the brutal winter of 1882, when survival was measured in pieces of firewood and hope was as scarce as warmth, one Native American mother faced a decision that would haunt her forever. She traded her own daughter, a beautiful, innocent 14-year-old girl named Dakota, for enough wood to last through the frozen months ahead. But sometimes, when all seems lost, fate has other plans. Sometimes, a lonely cowboy running from his own demons becomes the unlikely hero in someone else's story. And sometimes, the smallest act of kindness, like building a fire to keep someone warm, can ignite something much more powerful than flame. This is the incredible true-to-life story of Dakota, an Indigenous girl who was sold like property, and Ethan McKenna, a broken man who thought he'd never care about anyone again. It's a tale of survival, redemption, and a love that defied the boundaries between two worlds in the unforgiving American frontier. You're about to witness how a single moment of courage in a raging blizzard changed two lives forever. How a girl who had lost everything found the strength to trust again. And how a man haunted by tragedy discovered that sometimes, saving someone else is the only way to save yourself. Before we begin this emotional journey together, if you love stories that touch your heart and stay with you long after they end, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our powerful tales. Give this video a thumbs up if you believe in the power of human kindness, and let us know in the comments what you think about Dakota's story as it unfolds. Your engagement means the world to us and helps us bring you more incredible stories like this one. Now, let's step back into 1882, where the Dakota Territory was about to witness an extraordinary tale of love, loss, and redemption. The winter of 1882 struck the Dakota Territory with merciless fury, turning the landscape into a frozen wasteland where survival became the only currency that mattered. Snow fell in relentless sheets, piling against the doors of settlers' cabins and native camps alike, while the wind howled like the voices of restless spirits across the endless prairie. Dakota pressed her small frame against the thin walls of the ramshackle cabin that had become her prison, listening to the conversation that would seal her fate. The structure, cobbled together from weathered planks and chinked with mud and straw, offered little protection from the bitter cold that seeped through every crack. Ice crystals formed on the inside of the single window, and her breath came out in small puffs of white vapor as she strained to hear every word. "You're worth more than the wood we'd burn to keep warm," her mother, Anna, slurred, the smell of whiskey heavy on her breath. The bottle in her trembling hand was nearly empty, one of many that had found their way into their homes since the reservation traders had begun accepting anything of value in exchange for the burning liquid that promised to dull the sharp edges of grief and desperation. Dakota's heart sank as she studied her mother's face in the dim light of their meager fire. Ayana had once been a woman of remarkable beauty and strength, her long black hair adorned with beads and feathers, her voice carrying the traditional songs of their people across the evening air. She had taught Dakota to weave baskets from prairie grass, to identify healing plants, and to honor the spirits that dwelt in every living thing. But that woman seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by this hollow-eyed stranger who could barely look at her own daughter. The three men standing in their doorway were not the traders Ayana claimed them to be. Dakota had learned to read the intentions of men like these, their cold, calculating eyes that stripped away dignity with a single glance, the way they gripped their rifles like extensions of their own bodies, the crude language that spilled from their mouths like poison. The largest of them, Jenkins, stood well over 6 feet tall, his beard stained with tobacco juice and his coat reeking of unwashed wool and violence. His companions were no better, one thin as a rail with yellowed teeth and nervous, twitching hands, the other broad-shouldered with scars crisscrossing his knuckles. "Those traders, they need help with their camp," Ayana continued, her voice breaking slightly as she spoke the lie. "You'll work for them, and we'll have enough firewood to last until spring. Maybe even some food." Dakota watched in horror as her mother counted the meager stack of split logs the men had brought, perhaps 2 weeks' worth of fuel if they were careful. It was a pitiful payment for a daughter's life, and they all knew it. The men exchanged glances, dark smiles playing at the corners of their mouths as they watched the transaction unfold. "Mama, please," Dakota whispered in their native tongue, stepping forward with her hands clasped before her. Ina, these men, they are not good. I can see it in their eyes. Please don't do this. But Ayana turned away, unable to meet her daughter's gaze. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs as she clutched the doorframe, her knuckles white against the splintered wood. The woman who had once been the strongest person in Dakota's world had been broken by too many winters of loss. First her husband to the soldiers' bullets, then her older son to the fever that swept through the reservation, and now her remaining pride to the bottle that promised to numb the pain of losing everything. Jenkins spat a stream of tobacco juice into the pristine snow, leaving a brown stain that seemed to symbolize the corruption he brought to everything he touched. Deal's done, squaw. Girl comes with us now. His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted, and his cold blue eyes fixed on Dakota with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The thin man, who introduced himself as Pike, stepped forward with movements that reminded Dakota of a snake preparing to strike. His yellowed teeth were visible in what might have been a smile, and his calloused fingers reached for her wrist with casual cruelty. Come along, little rabbit. Time to earn your keep. Dakota tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron, biting into her skin with enough force to leave bruises. As they dragged her toward their horses, she looked back at her mother one last time, hoping against hope that Ayana would change her mind, would remember the woman she used to be and fight for her daughter. Ayana stood in the doorway like a figure carved from ice, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks and freezing before they could fall. Her lips moved silently, and Dakota knew she was praying in their ancient language, asking the spirits to forgive her for what she was about to do. But prayers wouldn't change the reality of their situation. The empty food stores, the dwindling firewood, the cold that would kill them both if they didn't find some way to survive the winter. The men tied Dakota's hands with rough rope that chafed against her skin, then forced her onto the back of a horse behind the third man, whose name she never learned. He reeked of sweat and violence, and his laughter was like the sound of breaking glass as they rode away from the only home she had ever known. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, the temperature dropped even further, and snow began to fall in thick, blinding sheets. The wind picked up, howling across the open prairie with a sound that seemed to echo the cries of her ancestors. Dakota closed her eyes and tried to remember her father's voice, the stories he used to tell about their people's resilience, about finding strength in the darkest moments. Dakota means friend to all, he had said, his weathered hands gentle as he braided her hair. No matter what happens, remember that you carry the strength of our people in your heart. The spirits will guide you, even when the path seems lost. She held onto those words as the men rode deeper into the storm, their horses struggling through the deepening snow. The cold was like a living thing, seeping through her worn coat and thin dress, numbing her fingers despite the threadbare gloves she wore. Ice formed on her eyelashes, and she could feel her lips turning blue as the wind whipped around them with increasing fury. The men cursed and shouted at each other over the growing roar of the wind, their voices harsh and ugly against the pristine silence of the snow-covered landscape. Their horses, hardy animals accustomed to harsh conditions, began to falter as the drifts grew deeper and the visibility dropped to mere feet. Should have waited for the storm to pass, Pike shouted, his thin voice barely audible over the wind. Too late now, Jenkins replied, his earlier confidence giving way to concern as he squinted through the swirling snow. Just keep riding. We'll find shelter. But Dakota could see the fear creeping into their eyes as the blizzard intensified. The storm was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a wall of white that seemed to swallow the world whole, erasing all landmarks and leaving them lost in a frozen wasteland. The temperature continued to drop, and she could feel the cold settling into her bones like a sickness. Then, through the chaos of the storm, she heard something that made her heart leap with hope, the sharp crack of gunshots echoing across the white wilderness. Someone else was out there in the storm, someone who might be her salvation or her doom. Ethan McKenna had been riding hard for 3 days through the unforgiving Dakota territory, his weathered leather chaps and wool coat providing little protection against the bitter winds that cut across the endless prairie. The ghosts of his past rode with him, the memory of his wife Sarah's laughter, the sound of his daughter Emma's feet running across the wooden floors of their Texas homestead, and the acrid smell of smoke that had filled his nostrils when he'd returned from the cattle drive to find his life reduced to ashes and blood. The blizzard had caught him off guard as he'd crested a ridge overlooking a frozen valley. One moment the sky had been clear and pale, the next it was dark with swirling clouds that promised death to anyone caught in the open. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Buck, had sensed the storm's approach before Ethan had, his ears pricked forward and his nostrils flaring as he tested the wind for danger. Ethan had found shelter in a grove of pine trees, their thick branches providing a natural windbreak that offered some protection from the howling fury of the storm. With practiced efficiency born of years on the trail, he'd built a small fire using dry wood from the interior of a fallen log, the flames dancing and crackling as they fought against the wind. The warmth felt good against his frost-bitten cheeks, and for a moment he'd allowed himself to close his eyes and remember what it felt like to be warm and safe. But the respite was short-lived. Through the roar of the wind and the hiss of snow hitting his fire, he heard something that made his blood run cold, the sharp crack of gunshots echoing across the white wilderness. The sound was unmistakable, cutting through the storm like a blade through silk. Ethan's hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 revolver holstered at his hip, the weapon's familiar weight providing a small measure of comfort in the face of unknown danger. He'd carried that gun for over a decade, and it had saved his life more times than he cared to count. The metal was cold against his palm as he drew it, checking the cylinder to ensure it was fully loaded. He kicked snow over his fire, watching the flames hiss and die as darkness reclaimed the grove. Buck snorted and stamped his hooves, sensing his master's tension. Ethan swung into the saddle with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent more of his life on horseback than on foot, his body moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd grown up in the saddle. Through the swirling curtain of snow, he could make out shapes moving in the distance. 3 men on horseback, their forms dark against the white landscape. But there was something else, something that made his jaw clench with recognition and rage. One of the horses carried a double burden, and the smaller figure was bound and struggling against its captor. The memories came flooding back, Sarah's screams, Emma's terrified cries, the sound of his own voice roaring in futile rage as he discovered their bodies. He'd sworn that day, kneeling in the blood-soaked dirt of his ruined home, that he'd never get involved in anyone else's troubles again. The price of caring was too high, the pain of loss too great to bear twice in one lifetime. "This ain't your fight, McKenna," he muttered to himself, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "You got no business getting mixed up in whatever this is." But even as he spoke the words, he was already spurring Buck forward, the horse's hooves finding purchase in the snow as they moved toward the distant figures. The bound figure was just a child, a girl who couldn't be more than 14 or 15, her long dark hair whipping in the wind as she struggled against her bonds. The 3 men were distracted, their voices raised in argument as they tried to decide which direction to head in the storm. Ethan recognized the type, hard men who lived by violence and took what they wanted from those too weak to fight back. He'd seen their kind before, and he knew that whatever they planned for the girl, it wouldn't end well for her. Using the blizzard as cover, Ethan approached from downwind, Buck's hooves muffled by the thick snow. The storm was both his enemy and his ally. It made visibility nearly impossible, but it also masked his approach. When he was close enough to make out the details of their faces, he called out through the howling wind, "Let the girl go." The 3 men spun around like startled wolves, their rifles coming up with practice speed. But the storm worked against them now, the swirling snow making it impossible to get a clear shot at the voice that had emerged from the white void. Jenkins, the largest of the 3, was the first to recover from his surprise. His bearded face was twisted with rage as he tried to peer through the storm, searching for the source of the challenge. "Who's out there?" he bellowed, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Someone who doesn't like what he's seeing," Ethan replied, his own voice carrying the authority of a man who'd faced down his share of killers. "Turn the girl loose and ride away, and we'll call it even." In the chaos that followed, Ethan managed to maneuver Buck between the men and their captive. The girl, Dakota, though he didn't know her name yet, watched him with wide, intelligent eyes that held more courage than fear. There was something in her expression that reminded him of Emma, the same quiet strength that had made his daughter seem older than her years. "Pike, The thin man with yellowed teeth raised his rifle with shaking hands. "You picked the wrong fight, Cowboy," he yelled, but his horse reared in panic as a sudden gust of wind nearly knocked him from the saddle. The animal's hooves flailed in the air, and Pike had to grab the saddle horn to keep from falling. Ethan didn't want to kill anyone. He'd seen enough death to last several lifetimes, but he wouldn't let them take the girl. His Colt came up smoothly and he fired a warning shot into the air. The sound cracked like thunder, echoing across the frozen landscape and causing the men's horses to dance nervously. "Walk away," he shouted, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who'd made his choice. "This storm's going to kill us all if we don't find shelter." The men looked at each other, weighing their options with the cold calculation of predators deciding whether prey was worth the risk. The girl wasn't worth dying in a blizzard for, especially not with an unknown gunman between them and their prize. Jenkins spat into the snow, the brown tobacco juice staining the pristine white. His cold blue eyes fixed on Ethan with a hatred that promised future trouble. "This ain't over, McKenna," he said, his voice carrying across the wind. "We know who you are. We know what you did down in Texas." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow, but he kept his face impassive. His reputation had followed him north, it seemed. The story of the Texas Ranger who'd lost his family and then hunted down their killers with single-minded fury was the stuff of legend in certain circles. As the three men disappeared into the white curtain of snow, their forms gradually swallowed by the storm, Ethan turned his attention to the girl. She sat motionless on the horse they'd abandoned, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. Her long black hair was matted with snow and ice, and her lips were turning blue from the cold that was seeping through her thin clothing. "Easy now," he said, approaching slowly with his hands visible. Buck snorted and shook his head, sending snow flying from his mane. "I'm not going to hurt you." She flinched when he reached for the ropes binding her wrists, but she didn't pull away. As he cut her free with his knife, he noticed the way she held herself, straight-backed and proud despite everything she'd been through. There was a dignity in her bearing that spoke of good breeding and strong character, qualities that no amount of hardship could completely erase. "What's your name?" he asked, wrapping his own heavy coat around her shoulders. The garment was too large for her small frame, but it would provide warmth against the bitter cold. "Dakota," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. The name was musical, unlike anything he'd heard before, and it seemed to suit her somehow. "Dakota," he repeated, the unfamiliar syllables feeling strange on his tongue. "I'm Ethan. We need to get out of this storm before we freeze to death." She nodded, her teeth chattering as the cold continued to seep into her bones. Ethan could see that she was close to the edge of exhaustion, her body trembling with more than just cold. Whatever she'd been through with those men, it had taken its toll. "Can you ride?" he asked, gesturing toward Buck. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now. "My father taught me." Something in the way she said it told Ethan that her father was no longer alive, another casualty of the harsh realities of frontier life. He helped her onto Buck's back, then swung up behind her, his arms creating a protective barrier against the wind. As they rode deeper into the storm, searching for shelter, Ethan found himself acutely aware of the girl's presence. She was small and vulnerable, yet there was a strength in her that reminded him of the women who'd helped tame the frontier. Whatever had brought her to this point, she was a survivor. The question was, what was he going to do with her now? The abandoned trapper's cabin was little more than 4 walls and a roof, but it was shelter from the blizzard that raged outside. Ethan had found it just as the storm reached its peak, and he'd practically carried Dakota inside when her legs gave out from exhaustion and cold. Now, as he worked to build a fire in the stone hearth, he could hear her teeth chattering behind him. She sat in the corner, still wrapped in his coat, watching his every move with those dark, intelligent eyes. "Haven't had a fire in who knows how long," he said, more to himself than to her. His hands were steady as he arranged the kindling, but his mind was churning. What was he supposed to do with her? He couldn't just leave her here, but he couldn't take care of a child either. He'd failed at that once before. The memory of his daughter Emma's laugh echoed in his mind, followed immediately by the image of her small body in the dirt outside their burned home. He shook his head, forcing the thoughts away. The fire caught, and warm light began to fill the cabin. Dakota moved closer, drawn by the heat, and for the first time since he'd found her, Ethan got a good look at her face. Despite the fear and exhaustion, there was something unbreakable in her expression, a strength that reminded him of his late wife. "You hungry?" he asked, pulling some dried meat from his saddlebags. She nodded, accepting the food with a quiet, "thank you," that barely reached his ears. As she ate, he noticed how she kept glancing at the door, as if expecting those men to burst through at any moment. "They're not coming back," he said. "Not in this storm." "You don't know them," Dakota replied, her voice stronger now. "They don't give up easy." Ethan studied her face in the firelight. "How'd you end up with them?" The question hung in the air for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My mother, she traded me for Firewood. She said I'd work for them, but I knew." She trailed off, staring into the flames. Ethan felt something twist in his chest. He'd seen a lot of hard things in his 32 years, but the idea of a mother selling her own child made his stomach turn. "Where's your family? Your tribe?" "2 days' ride north. But I can't go back. Not after." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking very young and very alone. The fire crackled between them, and Ethan found himself really looking at her for the first time. She was beautiful in the way that wild things were beautiful, untamed and natural. But it was more than that. There was something in her eyes that called to something in him, something he'd thought died with his family. "What's your plan?" she asked, breaking the silence. Ethan didn't have an answer. His plan had been to keep riding until he found a place where the past couldn't find him. But now, sitting in this cabin with this girl who'd been thrown away like trash, he wasn't sure about anything anymore. "Don't have one," he admitted. "Been running for so long, I forgot what I was running toward." Dakota nodded as if she understood. "My father used to say that sometimes the spirits put us exactly where we need to be, even when we can't see why." "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was. Before the soldiers came." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "He would have liked you. You have kind eyes." Something in Ethan's chest loosened at her words. When was the last time someone had called him kind? When was the last time anyone had looked at him and seen something other than a man running from his failures? Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the cabin, the fire burned warm and steady. For the first time in months, Ethan felt something other than emptiness. It scared him. 3 weeks had passed since the blizzard, and Ethan found himself reluctant to leave the small trading post where he'd brought Dakota to recover. She'd grown stronger each day, helping the elderly couple who ran the post with their daily tasks and teaching Ethan words in her native language during the long evenings. "Mitikui oyasin," she said one night as they sat by the fire. "It means, all my relations. My people believe we're connected to everything, the earth, the animals, each other." Ethan repeated the phrase, stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds. "All my relations," he said in English. "I like that." But their peaceful interlude was shattered when a group of riders approached the trading post. Ethan recognized the lead rider immediately. It was Chief Running Bear, Dakota's uncle, along with several warriors from her tribe. Dakota's face went pale when she saw them. "They've come for me," she whispered. The confrontation was tense but respectful. Chief Running Bear spoke in his native tongue, his words sharp with authority. Dakota translated, her voice shaking slightly. "He says I must return to the tribe. That I've been away too long, and people are talking. He says." She paused, looking at Ethan with something like pain in her eyes. "He says I've been living in the white man's world, and it's changing me." Ethan stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun belt, not as a threat, but as a statement. "She's not property to be claimed." One of the younger warriors moved his horse closer, his hand on his tomahawk, but Chief Running Bear held up a hand to stop him. He spoke again, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face. "He wants to know your intentions," Dakota translated. "He says if you care for me, you'll let me go back to my people where I belong." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. Where she belonged. He looked at Dakota, really looked at her, and saw the conflict in her eyes. Part of her wanted to go home, to be with her people. But part of her, the part that had grown during their time together, wanted to stay. "What do you want?" he asked her, ignoring the tension crackling between the two groups of men. Dakota was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. "I want to belong somewhere. I want to be part of something bigger than just surviving." Chief Running Bear spoke again, his tone softer now. Dakota's eyes filled with tears as she translated. He says, "My mother, she died 2 weeks ago. From the drinking. He says she asked for me at the end, said she was sorry." Ethan felt his heart break for her. He'd lost his parents young, knew the pain of unfinished business with the dead. But he also knew something else. He'd been running from connection, from caring about anyone, for too long. "I'm not going to make this choice for you," he said quietly. "But I want you to know something. These past weeks, they've been the best I've had since I lost my family. You make me remember what it feels like to hope." Dakota looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes, and he saw the moment she made her decision. She walked to her uncle and spoke in their language, her words carrying across the space between them like a bridge. Chief Running Bear nodded slowly, then looked at Ethan. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear. "She says she chooses both worlds. She will come with us for the winter ceremonies, to honor her mother and learn the old ways. But when spring comes, she will return to you if you will have her." Ethan felt something in his chest expand, like a flower opening to the sun. "I'll be here," he said, meeting Dakota's eyes. "I'll be waiting." As she rode away with her uncle and the other warriors, Dakota looked back once. In that look, Ethan saw everything he'd been afraid to hope for: love, belonging, and the promise of a future that honored both their worlds. The fire he'd built to keep her warm that first night had become something bigger, something that would burn steady and true no matter how far apart they were. And for the first time since he'd left Texas, Ethan McKenna knew exactly where he belonged. Then